Thank you. That title always startles me. I get kidded about it at home all the time. But I'm grateful to have it, and I'm grateful to be here, and I'm very excited about your presence, and I'm very, very excited about EDS. And so I'm glad you're here to experience it with us. When I started this role, which in March, so I've only been here maybe 5 weeks, I had 2 community meetings, and at both of them, I talked about how much I wanted people to feel joy when they came to this campus. Joy to be in community with one another, joy in their relationships with the faculty and the staff, and joy in learning. And I expressed that at both community meetings, and I express it to you today. I hope that you are feeling joy today in all of those same exact areas, among yourselves, with the faculty, the staff, and the students you might be seeing here, and the learning we will receive at this session. So joy for today and for the rest of this year is sort of the underlying goal, but it's not that kind of joy that we have at coffee hour or happy hour. It's the kind of joy we get in relationships. So I invite that to you, for you, during these days you're with us. It's really important that you know how much we know that you are needed for the life of this community. We need every single one of you to assist us in giving life, new hope to this community. We depend on your wisdom. I was just informed, told that I was going to get a letter to give me some ideas about a new way of thinking what we offer at this school. And just at that suggestion, I got very excited. So I invite that from you. Share your wisdom with us. Be unabashed about what you think and what your hopes are for EDS. Be involved with us and support us in every single way you possibly can, in every single way that word resonates with you. So I hope you are sensing that this is an exciting place. Raise your hand if you sense excitement. That's great. That's excellent. It's a place that's looking forward. It's a school that we love that has a bright future. That future cannot be realized without you. So in the excitement of these days that are ahead of you here, I want you to share your feelings with each other and with me and the staff and the faculty. I want you to understand that this learning that we're going to have today with this panel, and then later on with Sister Simone Campbell, will be something that will enliven our lives, not just as Christians, but as human beings in this world, which is really, truly the underlying mission of this school, helping people become fully human in the world. So I invite you to take part in everything we have to offer. We have plans for you today. Obviously, you're in the midst of them tomorrow. I invite you to enjoy everything. Enjoy everything. Connect with your fellow classmates and other alums. Meet new people. Enjoy these days. I especially invite you to talk with me if you have ideas or questions. I'll even take directions. But please speak with me if you have the time and the inclination. Speak with the faculty and the staff and any students that might be about who are not home writing papers at this time. They may come around. I also invite you to share your stories of this school that you obviously love so much. Share them with everybody that's here because we all love this school. And the students that are here right now love this school. They would love to hear your stories. I don't tell too many of my own because they're probably not very enlightening and enlivening for them, but yours might be. So please share your stories with the students you may see and with each other if you want to do reminiscing about your days here at EDS. So I cannot tell you now how impressed I am being asked to do this next thing. I cannot tell you how much I admire this person who's going to come before you right now. I want to introduce you to the academic dean and Harvey Guthrie Jr., Professor of Bible Culture and Interpretation. This person is a human being beyond all understanding to me. So I introduce you, Angela Bauer.
Thank you, Frank, and I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with this kind of semi-divination type thing here. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to these alumni days, and my task right at this moment is to welcome the panelists for this first panel, and then later welcome the panelists for the second panel. And on this first panel, to my far left, right, I'll start toward the window side, is one of our Jubilee alums, Mr. Jack Calhoun. And you can find a short bio summary for all the panelists in your folders, so I'm not spending time reading those all for you. Next to, in the middle, we have the Reverend Sarah Monroe. And then to my immediate right, Dr. Richard Morrisroe. And now I turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Pam Conrad, who is just about finishing her first year in the distributive learning option of the MDiv program, and who does other quite amazing things, as you can see in there. Pam.
Well, good afternoon, and I don't want to waste any time from the panel, so I think we're going to get right to it. The ground rules are this. 10 minutes per person. They've been lobbying heavily to start early and start the clock late. I'm not allowed, or Justin's going to throw up a big sign. So why don't we go in order, and we'll start with Jack, and I will start the stopwatch.
It hasn't started yet.
Ready? Start talking, and then I'll hit go.
I'm honored to share thoughts with you today. It's delightful being back and sharing thoughts from the seismic events of 50 years ago. I wondered why Jonathan wore his collar all the time. Why wasn't he out in the streets picketing with us? Why wasn't he tutoring? What kind of theological nerd was this? He spoke Greek. He didn't play volleyball with us or touch football. We were on the same floor, and then he went south and was killed. Jonathan taught me two things. Whenever I needed courage for my work with tough kids in broken communities, or when I picketed, all I had to do was think of him, a talisman. You think you're putting yourself on the line, Calhoun? Compared to him, I did no lines. Whether I was having stones thrown at me in Folsom, Pennsylvania, integrating a community, or more recently picketing after the shootings in Newtown, Connecticut. Second lesson was the collar. In a burst of adolescent indignation following the riots, the shootings, the maimings, the hosings, 50 years ago, I stormed into Dean Coburn's office full of adolescent self-righteousness and said, "Why isn't this school closed? Why aren't all the faculty out in the streets? The bishop's wife just got arrested." He looked at me with Dean Coburn's calm, classic depth and said, "Somebody's got to keep the flame alive. We're keeping the Ark of the Covenant here, which restores you to give you the courage to do what you're doing and gives you meaning why you're doing what you're doing." So John's collar, the Ark. The collar I never wore. I did not get ordained. I worked here as a youth worker and community organizer in Boston. I wind up doing diversion programs, restorative justice. I was head of youth services, appointed by Carter to run the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families. I was pretty much unchurched. I started the National Crime Prevention Council, which had a dual mission, stopping violence and helping build caring communities. Until I met Maddie Lawson. She and I were on the board together, African-American woman from Oakland, California. How did you get here, Maddie? I asked. She said, I had 2 kids. I lost them both to gang violence. Now I have 400 kids. Maddie was not crippled by her staggering, I don't know of a more horrible tragedy which would have crippled me had I lost my kids. And she didn't come to her work as a whole person. She came to us, as all of us, as a wounded healer trying to heal the unhealed wounders. Maddie and King, who so inspired my work, came into new light. King, I believe, did not begin with Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. He began with a passionate moral commitment that wound up in policy. His framing was Exodus, escape from slavery, wandering in the desert, a view of the promised land and of equality, unheard of, madness, holy madness. But that story found its way into every living room. Every one of us were deeply, deeply affected. And I felt my long over-barnacled faith coming back. My slow epiphany actually allowed me to see that many people that I worked with across the country through the 13-city violence prevention network I started in California, and it was adopted by Eric Holder as the National Forum, cops, social workers, clinicians, street workers were to an extraordinary degree people of faith. And these were folks who inspired my book, Hope Matters, which is a neighborhood bestseller. Most of my friends and neighbors have bought it. And Hope Matters, the untold story of how faith works in America. And what's under it is the public story of faith is a violent separation. My God is bigger and better. These are the themes that connect us: a faith that heals, does not wound, reconciles, doesn't separate. My Maddie spurred lens reframed my thinking and my language and my speaking. I do a lot of public policy speaking, but I always wind up with something around the theme of Hero Israel. I've called thee by name, thou art mine, which I think is the core of theology and social policy. I had started a program called Youth as Resources, where kids spot social issues about which they're concerned. They design the projects, and if funded, they run them. You could fill the walls with all that stuff they've done: domestic violence, child abuse, crime prevention, et cetera, et cetera. Would it work with really tough kids, marginalized kids? We experimented with it in the Indiana Girls' School, and you have to be pretty tough, pretty disturbed to get locked up as a young woman in Indiana. Erin Jacoba and 3 of her friends started a project where they went into a home where kids had terminal cerebral palsy. At my first failed retirement, Erin spoke, and she said, Jack, when I went into that institution, it was the first time in my life I have ever been thanked. And I wondered at that time where her name had been. Stubborn children lists, truancy lists, police blotters, court dockets, correction intake forms. And then I thought of how many kids out there are anomic, without name, or who can't stand their names. Who names them? Who claims them? And in my work, the gangs are very good at rebaptizing. The Jacks and the Dons and my fellow paddlists become Shooter, Highboy, Needle, Ratman, which are real names from the LA gang files. I have called thee by name incredible theology, incredible social policy. I'm riding in a car with Billy Dupes and Jay Jimenez in the Coliseum area in Oakland, West Oakland. There are street workers, 11:30 at night, doing a little trash talking. Do I have the right clothes for gang work? Man, you're not dressed right. Do I have the right car? I drive a Subaru. Man, you're wrong. You got to get a low rider. I said, if you guys are so great and you pull up to Don and he's got his boys on the corner, what is your first word? What is the first thing you guys, if you're so hot, what do you say? And he said, hey, loved one. I said, what? He said, or hey, nephew. Think about it. It's the language of claim. It's the language of family. I was speaking up here a couple of years ago at the Mass Human Service Providers Convention a lot of folks out there and work with kids, trauma, counseling, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, you're doing great work. Where do you begin with, let's work on your delinquency, or hey, loved one? Does the claim begin first before the pathology? You're not serious. 2 minutes? I just said hello. Another just quick vignette. There's something called ceasefire or call-in, where the shot callers, the heavy guys in the community, are pulled into kind of a U, and they're in the back, one side of the cops and the other side of the people who are providing services. I'm in the back, and in front of me is a guy heavily tattooed and dreadlocked. And the cops have their stuff on the wall and said, you've done this, this, and this. If you so much as spit, you're going to do 25 years at Leavenworth. We know who you are. But please listen to the other guys. And so then the helpers stand up, whether it's drug abuse counseling or GED or whatever it is. And then the, quote, moral voice of the community comes in. It was Kathy Jenkins, who's little. Now I'm in back, and she comes forward, and she comes up to this guy, and he said, son, what's your name? And he flexes and says, Popeye. And then she gets right up in his face and said, son, what did your mama call you? And he visibly shrank and whispered, Kevin. So I wondered, where were we when Kevin's name became a source of shame? And who was there to rebaptize him and claim him? Kathleen, one more minute. Kathleen asked us to think about social justice needs facing our community. I would say the violent crime, the fear of crime, and the attendant loss of jobs, obscene availability of guns, absent dads, and a horrible tax structure. Problem is how to get people to march behind this. It's such a bifurcated agenda. I marched in Chantilly after the shootings in Connecticut, the NRA saying, get your guns now. The government's, there are more people than they ever had, 3,000 people there. 25 of us were marching. And at my age, marching is a little difficult. Knees, ankles, always on the lookout for porta potties. And you have to wear a tag in case you forget where you came from. You know, return to sender or whatever it says. Kathleen, where's Kathleen? Also, there you are. Kathleen, you also asked us to ask where our inspiration came from. I know where it comes from. For me, it's the people with whom I've worked who are so inspired and quickened, to use that old word, by faith. And for me, the uneasy balance between the Ark and the covenant remains. I will continue to be deeply embedded in this work and policy and program as long as I can. But I also realize that then perhaps, I don't know, it's intimations or mortality or whatever, but the sacramental is more attractive than it's ever been. The smudge on the forehead is a reminder of our mortality and need for forgiveness. The communion that really brings us together as a community. The confession reminding us that we're not the center of the universe, and the commissioning us to engage with the poor, the wounded, the angry, and the voiceless. And to be honest, Sacramento, which judges, pushing me, keeping before me the fact that 1/3 of us are poor, that 1/3 of young boys and men of color will serve time in prison, reminding me that this nation must again, as we did 50 years ago with John and Martin, march.
Thank you. Sarah.
Hello. I am going to ask, some of you may have been following my work, some of you have not. I'm going to ask, though, that we start with this really short, I was one of the persons that lobbied for more than 10 minutes, but I'm going to ask that we start with a short moment of silence. I will explain more about my ministry and who I'm working with and what I'm doing, but on my flight over here, I was made aware that the group that I'm working with right now and the folks that I'm organizing with right now have been receiving death threats. And so I'm asking that we have a moment of silence and prayer for them and their protection. Thank you. So I'm a much newer alum of EDS. I only graduated 2 years ago, and I've only been ordained a year. So I have no memory of civil rights movement, and certainly no memory of Jonathan Daniels, though I always did think that his ghost haunted the haunted the campus. But those of you who saw me come in probably noticed I was wearing a lager jacket and lager boots. I call that my uniform. Most of what I do is street ministry in the Pacific Northwest on the coast of Washington State. And the shoes I'm wearing we call them Romeos. You're either a farmer or a logger. I grew up a farmer, so I wear them, and it's kind of my identification with the place I come from. I grew up in a really poor community in a working class family in Western Washington. And as I studied here in seminary, as one of the first people in my family to go to graduate school, I thought a lot about how important it was for the church to be active in poor and working class communities, and to rethink how we do that in the church, particularly in the mainline church. Because we often approach, at least philosophically approach, poor and working communities from the perspective of being either providers or saviors or some such thing, and not recognize the leadership among poor communities, and not recognize or allow for full participation of those communities in the life of the church, and in our wider mission. And so that's been something I've thought a lot about in my ministry. I started and founded Chaplains on the Harbor right out of seminary as a deacon, on a hope and a prayer. And a lot of my inspiration came from my work here at EDS, both from my professors and from working with Ecclesia Common Cathedral on the Boston Commons, assuming many of you are aware of their work. We're dedicated to three things at Chaplains on the Harbor, and one of them is a ministry of presence, is to be a ministry of presence on the street. We're in Grays Harbor County. It's one of the westernmost counties of the state, certainly one of the poorest counties in the state. And I do a lot of building relationships and walking around on the street and building relationships both with people who are homeless and people who are struggling with poverty, which is about half of our population, with really a goal of affirming the dignity and worth of people. The second thing we're dedicated to doing is building worshiping communities. Work in two places. I work in Aberdeen, which is the largest town in the county, about 16,000 people. It's a grand city. And in Westport, which is a much smaller fishing town just a couple miles around the harbor. And we do that through a lot of different ways, by eating together and celebrating Eucharist together. And we're very deeply grounded in Bible study as a way to develop leadership and as a way to open up opportunities for people to claim their stories and to claim their leadership. We have a church building in Westport, and we borrow church buildings in Aberdeen. And one of the things that I have noticed working in poor communities is the shrinking access to space, is that poor communities more and more have less and less access to public space, and less access to gathering space. And so we have people who come together in a small town who haven't seen each other in 10 or 15 years because there's been no place to gather. And so part of our ministry is just providing that space. And last, we have a strong commitment to developing leadership on the ground, to developing leadership for organizing and to amplify the voices of the leaders that we work with. Okay, so those are our commitments. That's kind of how we've started. Aberdeen is the whole county, actually. We have a 25% poverty rate. 25% of our population lives below the federal poverty line, but 50% of our population accesses social services, so is poor or low income. And this is pretty much on par. It might sound shocking in Cambridge, but it's pretty much on par with most small cities and small towns and rural areas across the country. It's not, Aberdeen is not an anomaly. So some of my work has been, a lot of times when we talk about street ministry or poverty, we think of inner cities. Rural towns, suburban areas, small cities are all experiencing some pretty deep poverty. What it looks like in Aberdeen is we had as the U.S. towns have deindustrialized, what that looked like in Aberdeen is that the logging industry and the fishing industries have just declined very rapidly, leaving people with really, really high rates of unemployment and underemployment. My generation was hardest hit, and it's also the largest demographic in Aberdeen. So there's a whole generation, several generations of people now that have not had access to steady or viable work. And what that looks like is a lot of people couch surfing, a lot of people on the street, and an increasing criminalization of poverty. As there's higher and higher penalties for doing what it takes to survive. So most of the people I work with are in and out of jail or in and out of prison. Currently, we're in the middle of, and the reason I asked for a moment of silence is that we're in the middle of a fight with the city. They moved to evict the largest homeless encampment in the area. We've gone to city council and have done a lot of organizing around this, and we've received a lot of support from the community and also a lot of backlash, which is where some of the death threats are coming from. What I have learned the most in this ministry is to rely on leadership on the ground, that not to approach poor people or people who are homeless as problems that need my solutions or anyone else's solutions, but to see folks as agents of their own liberation. They are the experts, they have the solutions, and they have been fully capable leaders. We have seen such amazing leadership as we've developed this ministry, and also as the camps have organized. They have self-organized themselves, they've stepped up to tell their own stories, they've taken incredible risks to stand up both for themselves and for their community. Risks in the wider community and risks in the city, and risks of arrest, which carries some pretty heavy repercussions if you're poor. That's the first lesson I've learned. Two other lessons, and I'll go quickly. A lot of what we've done, Aberdeen and Grace Harbor County is predominantly white, but we have significant Native community and Latino immigrant communities there as well, growing very quickly. And we've worked hard to talk about what does it mean to address racism in poor white communities? What does it mean to have those conversations? And what does it mean to build relationships across racial lines? And one of the ways this has happened is in our community in Westport, just opened a couple of months ago. And over Easter, we had an Easter vigil with a fully bilingual service. Half of our congregation was English speaking and half Spanish speaking. Right after that, there was an ICE raid, and a good portion of folks that we were building relationships with were detained. And there was this incredible sense of outrage and solidarity coming from white workers in the community, asking how they could stand with and support folks their neighbors who were facing repression from immigration and customs. And the third thing, we talk about this a lot, and some of the importance of the language we use. So I work in a context where all the dominant narratives, religious and political and social, blame poor people for their poverty. What we talk about is, what does it mean to build a movement to end poverty led by the poor? And that sounds like a huge, ginormous thing that will never happen, but just that narrative transforms how people think about themselves and how we think about what we're doing. We talk about a bigger dream. There's a tremendous power in that narrative, and it also connects us to movements across the country. And we're able to talk about, in Aberdeen, what's happening in Ferguson and what's happening in Baltimore. It breaks our sense of isolation to talk about the fact that 50% of Americans are poor and low income, and that that we in Aberdeen are not the only people experiencing this. Taking a cue from Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign, where he called for poor people across racial lines to become a new and unsettling force. And so those are some of the most important things I've learned, and I will thank you for your continued prayer, particularly for our leaders on the ground.
Thank you, Sarah. I promise you all that we'll come back to all these topics, and I'm going to turn it over to Richard now.
I thought all Episcopal seminarians were required to wear collars. I was in jail with Jonathan, and he wore his collar. He wore his collar at the time he was shot and killed. I had a Madras short-sleeve shirt that was very comfortable. It was my vacation time. I was not, as a result, required to wear a collar, and Mr. Coleman, apparently, the man who shot and killed Jonathan, man who lived happily until 1997, and said he would do it again. He was not biased. He was out to shoot those with collars and those without collars. He seemed to somehow believe that if he were to rid Lowndes County of these white outside preachers, not only would things be better, but that the people would return to their proper role, their proper subservience. I visited here the first time with Connie Daniels, Jonathan's mother. I spent 10 days with Jonathan before he died. I learned Jonathan, about him, about his community, Keene, New Hampshire, about Episcopal Divinity School, all after Jonathan had died, and came here with his mother in 1967. Was thinking of it as I flew into Logan Field this morning, jumped on a bus for Keene, and then within a week was down here with Jonathan's mother, Connie Daniels, who was at that time only 62 years old. She was, Jonathan died on her 60th birthday. And the video that some of you have seen points that out, how his sister, Emily, who died this last November, how she very much wanted Jonathan to be home for his mother's birthday. And he would come back in a coffin. He would come back with some of the people like Mrs. West and Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, who had wanted to thank him for having been given to the people of Lowndes County and for having witnessed with his life the people of Lowndes County. I came back a couple of other times. I came back in 1990 with Ruby and with Emily, Jonathan's sister. That was the 25th anniversary. we celebrated a secular feast in Keene, New Hampshire, and a sacral feast here at EDS. We dedicated the icon that is in the chapel. I took that icon to speak at a Black Episcopal church in Gary, Indiana about 2 months ago, and I took it along as an illustration and decided that it really should be much better cited in the Church of St. Augustine in Midtown Gary than sitting in the Morris Rose bedroom, and Mrs. M was not, she can testify, was quite willing to let us leave that gift of Jonathan's life and of the many martyrs who he symboled. Those of you who know that, the people who were part of his life, what that meant. The Weston Jesuits, it's a curious, the seminary that I went to for the Archdiocese of Chicago was a very rare place. It had diocesan administrators, but it had faculty and spiritual directors were of the Jesuit community, the Midwestern province. And so while that is no longer the situation here at EDS, it is very much part of my life and my being here. I think of Daniel Harrington, who died this last March, a very gifted scripture scholar who gave a lot of his life here and published New Testament abstracts and other kinds of things during the years that he was here. The Daniels Fellowship. Emily Daniels suggested that I go back and do some divinity studies. I finished a Doctor of Ministry and shared that in 1998, the same year that Ruby was graduating from here at EDS. At Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, we're able to commute to Boston easier than to Hyde Park on Chicago's South Side. It would well have been done here. I shared that with Craig Mooson. Craig Mooson, who's worked at DePaul University and who's one of the articles in the EDS Now, someone I've been enjoyed to know. Craig is also a lawyer, minister, as is Calvin Hawkins, who is a city judge in East Chicago, Indiana, where I've lived for the last 40-some years. And all three of us share the fact that we are Jonathan Daniels Fellows and that our lives have been very much enriched by Jonathan. Calvin Hawkins was very much enjoyed watching Here I Am Now, Lord Send Me. Watched the movie, shared it with his family, and just thought it was wonderful. So I have a few things. One, I have a few words that were written in jail with Jonathan. This was put to you, I write to you for many reasons. The first is to share some unpublished jottings written in a small 3x5 notebook, which a black iron worker, John McMean, shared with me in our overcrowded Lowndes County jail cell. On August 16, 1965, he wrote, "It happened in a town called Fort Deposit, Saturday, August 14th, 1965. You're aware of the irony of Jonathan's feast day, Jonathan Daniels, seminarian and martyr, not being the 20th of August. It's not the 20th because Jonathan could not bump St. Bernard, also known as St. Bernard in the African American community. The irony is that the Catholic Church in Keene, New Hampshire is St. Bernard's, and that Jonathan was able to share his life and ministry and his feast day with us, but somehow he came up against a saint from the 10th century who wrote, among other things, great inspiring work on the Song of Songs. And so anyway, that's the day that they celebrate Jonathan's feast, where civil rights workers began picketing the streets near Waters Dry Goods Store and others, where groups of whites gathered in large numbers with gunshots, clubs, and nightsticks. Then out of the crowd a loud voice was heard, "Put them niggers in jail for disturbing the peace and parading without a permit." One SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee worker, asked Walter Stokes, "On what charge? Picketing isn't illegal. We have a right to picket." Stokes exclaimed, "Niggers don't have any rights in Fort Deposit. Get on, move before I kill some of you niggers." We all walked over to the jailhouse without an incident of violence. We had 2 groups of picketers, a group for 3 places, Waters Dry Goods Store, Herb's Sweet Shop, and the Ralph McGough Grocery Store, in protest of high prices. We stayed in jail for an hour or more until arrangements were made to get us to Hayneville and to the Lowndes County Jail. Jonathan got to Hayneville through EDS. He got to Hayneville through his family. He got to Hayneville through the gift of his father, who was a tremendous physician in the community of Keene, who killed himself at about age 59, just worked himself to death for the people of Keene. And how it is, I think of, I want to share a little bit with you about leaving Selma before the 50-mile march began. I had not met Jonathan's then. We were each part of different teams. Mine was the Catholic Interracial Group, he of the Episcopal Society of Cultural and Racial Unity, from Boston to California. Only later would I get to know some of them well, is during this past 49th summer with its Lowndes County pilgrimage for the Alabama martyrs. I met Jonathan Myrick Daniels in Birmingham, site of Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference meeting. The meeting was held in the same 16th Street Baptist Church where 4 girls had been bombed into heaven in September 1963. After 4 days of meetings, John Lewis and Stokely Carmichael introduced me to Jonathan, believing we had something in common, some things to share. Today, with you, I face a similar question. Was Jonathan Daniels' death in Hayneville, Alabama, from a sheriff's 12-gauge shotgun worth it? Was my own near death worth it, as our country seems so much at odds, so unable to find any common ground about immigration, unemployment insurance, food stamps, voter identification? I believe the answer to be yes, but to explain my belief, I have to tell a series of stories, some of which I can tell, but perhaps a few of those will come out in the question and answer period. I came to Selma, and I just want to share one brief thing with you. One important point is to those of you who saw the movie Selma. The movie omitted the January 1963 National Conference on Religion and Race. Held in Chicago, Cardinal Albert Meyer co-chaired the event. Meyer, who contributed much to Vatican II, ordained me in April of 1964. The conference made a commitment to support Dr. King, not just with words, but with deeds. And after the Bloody Sunday bridge slaughter, Dr. King called in that commitment. And I was one of thousands who were part of a joint response of Protestants and Catholics, Orthodox and Jews. And so it's so very important to know that we weren't kind of individuals who were responding to a need, but we were part of an organized effort of the major churches in this country and unions as well, the auto workers, the steel workers, people who kind of made a commitment that Dr. King was able to draw on and call in that card, that commitment. And Jonathan and I, 6 months later, 6 months after the March of Selma in August of 65, met, and our lives have been intersecting ever since. And as questions go on, perhaps we can share more. I just want to apologize for kind of drifting back into the past, but I thought I do have a kind of unique perspective and did want to share that with you as part of this commemoration. This Alumni Weekend is in memory of Jonathan. Thank you.
all three of you have talked about milestones along the evolutionary path that has brought you to today. I'd like to hear from each of you an answer to the same question. How has this informed and transformed you, these experiences, some of which may be hard to articulate as distinct events, and some which may be as fresh and distinct as if they were yesterday? Where do you see the transformation in your present journey? And why don't we start with you, Richard, since you alluded to having more to say?
Well, my life, after being shot, I was carted off above Jonathan in a hearse, which is what emergency medical vehicles used to be years ago. They weren't as elaborate as they are now. I was alive and flailing above Jonathan, who was already dead. And we passed out of Lowndes County. I can still remember the pine trees. I was taken to Baptist Hospital, where Jimmy Lee Jackson was not taken because he was black, even though he triggered the famous march from Selma to Montgomery. And he had some medical care, but did not have the kind of assistance that I had for those 11 hours of surgeons, two of whom, Charles Cox and Frank Miles, had a lot of medical experience during the Korean War. I was lucky that a young Irish priest was able to corner Cox and have Cox look in on me, and Cox put together the team of 6 surgeons who would labor 11 hours on a Friday night in August. It's just incredible that they were working at all on a Friday night in August, let alone working 11 hours to heal this northern preacher. Those 6 months in the hospital, both in Montgomery Baptist Hospital for a month, and then the later 5 months at Oak Park Hospital just west of Chicago, kind of changed me. And I think that the 12 years of seminary formation that had me as pretty much a straight shooter. I still remained a straight shooter. My wife thinks that I've never left the ministry. But it kind of made a difference, and in the years after, the 8 years I stayed with the Archdiocese of Chicago and then resigned, I just think that so much happens. God knows where Jonathan would have been had he lived. I suppose he'd still be wearing a collar, even in retirement, but we should remember John's sister Emily. I think I mentioned Emily. Did I mention Emily? Yeah. What happened to me was I was refused the opportunity to return to the Black Catholic parish where I had worked. And so the parish where I was temporarily assigned, which was Chicago's Holy Name Cathedral, which was a great badge of honor, as some viewed it, kind of house arrest as others viewed it. During those years became interesting. I began to learn Spanish. I visited many of the Hispanic families, and the young lady who I eventually married is originally from Puerto Rico, came to Chicago as an exchange teacher, and when I could no longer return to the black community, I went to work in the Hispanic community on the Northwest Side. The world I've lived in for the last 40 years is about 50% Hispanic, 45% African American, 5% honkies like myself. But it's an interesting community. It's a community that was for many years the site of Inland Steel, East Chicago, Indiana. It had Standard Oil of Indiana, which later became Amoco and is now BP, has a major part of its facility not only in Whiting, Indiana, but in East Chicago, Indiana. It's difficult to know that how few of the jobs at those major plants, now ArcelorMittal and BP, are held by the local people who used to be able to walk to those plants, that people drive 30, 40, 50 miles to get to those plants and to be making very good money, 60, 80, 100,000 a year. But the locals have very few of those jobs and have often minimum wage kinds of jobs or very modest employment. So I think I've drifted, and it's time to hand on the baton.
And Sarah, I'm going to ask you to take the baton next. And if you wouldn't mind capitalizing on this theme of access and the imprisonment of poverty.
Yes. So is it? So just repeating the question, is it what's inspiring me in my journey now?
It's what has transformed you about what formed you, and where will that lead you?
Oh, okay. Well, we'll see what I can do with that. Talking about, I will address the question of the criminalization of poverty as well. What's most transformative for me is witnessing the leadership on the ground of folks that I work with. I think it's always easy as a young seminary student to come into communities and think that you're going to be the transformation, and it doesn't work like that. But what inspires and transforms me the most is the leadership that I see developing on the ground, and predominantly young leadership, young adults taking leadership. Our leaders are folks that the deck has been stacked against them since they were born. When I talk about the criminalization of poverty in this country, if any of you have been following the DOJ reports coming out of Ferguson, you'll have noticed the fact that I forget how many warrants are out for people in Ferguson, but majority of people, in other words, have multiple warrants out for their arrest. Pretty much almost everything you have to do to survive as a poor person ends up being criminalized, especially in towns like Aberdeen or Ferguson. And what that looks like is you have a suspended license or you can't afford insurance, and so you get pulled over and you get ticketed, and the ticket's a couple $100 and you can't afford the ticket. And so those fines accumulate, and finally a bench warrant is issued for your arrest. And so most people have multiple instances where that happens, multiple warrants out for their arrest. In Aberdeen, for example, it's illegal to camp in the city limits. It's illegal to loiter. It's illegal to sleep in a public area. It's illegal to do a lot of things. Illegal to do anything that you don't have access to space to do. So it becomes illegal to eat, sleep, everything you need to do. And so when that happens, what cities do is impose fines, which result in warrants. Most of the folks and most of our leadership probably has warrants out for one thing or another, which makes standing up for yourself incredibly, incredibly risky. Because everybody is in and out of jail and in and out of the criminal justice system. If you get arrested when you show up to city council to speak up for yourself and for your community, you're going to spend a lot of time in jail, because you're not only because there's an accumulation of charges. So what's incredibly inspiring for me is the amount of courage that people demonstrate in standing up for their community and standing up for their friends and standing up for themselves, because it takes a hell of a lot of courage to walk in to a meeting with the mayor and the police chief and the city council members when you know you might not walk out of there a free person. It takes an incredible amount of courage to do that when city council members and the city attorney are publicly calling you names to your face. And it takes a lot of courage to do that when property owners are threatening to kill you. So a lot of what transforms me is what folks are teaching me.
If I may just quickly, working in local government for so long, it's amazing to find out how much of Ferguson was a kind of off-balance sheet way of financing the local government.
It is in a lot of small cities and towns.
Yeah, in ways that, that just almost incredible.
Yep.
There's so much that both of you said. Just picking up on your very last words, courage. And you really wonder our role in encouraging and where that is coming from and how that is sustained. And when I think about the blessing we had so many years ago, I mean, we were encouraged by this movement, and we were encouraged by faith, but we were encouraged by song. We were encouraged by clarity of mission. And as you were speaking, I was wondering how we get to that with the poor, just as you said so eloquently, to make that an issue that it gets us up on our back legs and marching again, because that's, I'm dealing with about 30 cities now, and several of them, Baltimore, Philly, Camden, Cleveland, have the same issue about the manufacturing jobs and the absence of those jobs. And we're spending billions overseas, and we could have a national, well, I won't get into that national job effort, but anyway, you asked about the transformational. For me, coming here 5 decades ago, or whatever the numbers are, it was more undergirding what I came for, because it was known, this school was known for that. I did not come for academic reasons or ordination. But the transformation of late for me, as I said, has been the arc, and reminding me why in a certain inarticulate way I may have been drawn to this school, in addition to into the work and the people, again, to echo your theme, that encourage me are the local leaders and those who walk their faith and who aren't looking to convert but are putting themselves on the line every day. And so that's my source. But the challenge is how we get this country up on its back legs again, because you're just absolutely right. 1/3 poor, 1/3 of black folks in the communities I deal with will serve time, and they will, after jail, continue to serve time in terms of driver's licenses, jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So that to me is a challenge. And then how do we encourage that? And what is our role? And I think you, part of what is the role of the, quote, established church in helping to do that? I was in Cleveland 6 weeks ago, and we were driving past a lot of empty churches. And Mike Walker, who's the activist there, head of the mayor's prevention work, said most of the black middle class families have left. And so the issue is both race and class. And he said the energy when I was doing work here in the 70s was so amazing. And then a lot of, he said, my compatriots made it, and they come on Sundays, but they're not part of the community. And so it's a challenge in both ways. And just one final note on the police issue, and I wrote a blog about this recently. To me, that's not the driving issue. That's a convenient issue. It's huge. There's race involved in this, horrible racial stuff. It's also police practice, because a lot of the officers in Baltimore are minority, the mayor's minority, the chief of police, Batts, whom I know fairly well, is minority. But to me, what this really ripped open was the seething anger under it all, the unemployment, the terrible schools, the wage disparity, and I don't know whether you know the poverty game, which is a game. I'm a single parent, I'm working 2 jobs, I make the rent, and then somebody runs into my car, and there's rent or health. Step forward, and then food stamps reduced. Now it's Cheerios. It's an amazing thing, and the tension that creates also the mental health issues. So I too am rambling, Michael, but you know, it's part of the age thing, right? But I think just the bottom line here for me is the transformation I don't feel, and that is, where is the anger, where is the indignation about this now? And that's, to me, a challenge, and while I keep doing what I'm trying to do.
What does justice look like?
It depends what zip code you're in.
What would you like it to look like?
Which order are we going in?
Have at it.
Well, my comment is really quite accurate. I mean, if I can afford a shrink and I'm in a white community and my son gets into trouble, Your Honor will take care of it. And if not, it's going to be trouble. And there's going to be, the first response is either criminalization of it, probation, or jail. What I'm beginning to see is a lot of diversion going on even in the station houses, which is encouraging. It's idiosyncratic. It's here, it's there, it's a chief here, it's a chief there. Boston, my dear community, they have social workers now in many of the police stations working on informal justice, informal ways of dealing with this, and trying to stop the charges, trying to stop deeper penetration into the system. It's almost an impossible question because you want to talk about just schools, you want to talk about just wages. That justice can apply to many, many, many things. But from my perspective, working in the criminal justice system writ large, I see a lot of hope at different levels, but it's not across the board. I'm seeing it in probation. I'm seeing an increase in restorative justice in schools. They're starting a lot of that in schools. I'm seeing some differences in the judiciary, but it is idiosyncratic and not across the board. But I think by focusing on the criminal justice system, just like we focus on police, if we can solve the police issue, we've solved the problem. That's crap. It's justice in terms, as I said, wages, health, your point, access to public spaces, et cetera.
Let me ask you all a permutation of that question. Let's say we have all dispensed with the notion of retributive justice, and imagine that we have moved through restorative justice. I invite you to imagine, what is transformative justice?
So, I'm going to go back just a bit to the first question now. What does justice look like? And I think it looks like life, a right to life, being able to live. I think it's the right not to get shot. It's the right to, what Martin Luther King said, a right to a decent life. I think you said something about anger, John, and one of the things in the community that I'm working with, there can be a sense of communal despair over just kind of the long decades of not enough work and not enough hope for the future and all of those things. And I always see anger as a sign of life. And one of the things I take hope from is that poor people are already marching all over the country. And young people are taking up leadership in movements all over the country. And I think one of the things that's hard for us to do, sitting here maybe, is to take our cues from the ground, from the communities who are most affected, from the communities who are already marching, from the communities who are telling the world what the problems are and what the solution is. And I think we have to start there. We can't think that we can tell people what the problems are. I think that's something maybe that I'm learning most about justice and what transformation in our systems of justice look like is talking to the people and listening to the people most affected. So Ferguson and Baltimore and Aberdeen and everywhere in between.
I've seen, just Richard, if you want to jump in?
Go ahead.
You were very kind. Thank you. I've seen it with the Justice's reconciliation work I did here. I was struck by the fact of how many kids said, yeah, I ripped off Richard, but I had a lousy lawyer. The scariest conjunction of admission of guilt but denial of any connectedness. So this is way back in the mid-'70s. I had kids meet their victims with community people as mediators. And the message was dual. You're responsible. But B, you have the more important message. You have something of worth that somebody needs. You can make whole. And the results of that were really extraordinary. It wasn't just a balance sheet. You did this, therefore you owe. And the balance sheet is squared. There was dignity in that, a giving back. And story after story of kids, well, I got a call about 10 years ago from somebody who had to repair a playground. And that was because he trashed it with his friend. And he was talking about the job he got because of the skills he learned repairing that playground. But the message, the deeper message, I think, was you can help make whole. There's a certain dignity in that. That wasn't the structural, but you talked about transformative justice, and I've really seen it in a lot of this restorative justice work. Not just quantitative. You took it. One guy said to me, well, I could do a lot of stories, but my point is there was dignity and transformation in that. Richard, thank you.
Someone is raising her hand.
Yes, I was about to do that, and I just wanted to give Richard a chance first to respond to the other questions.
Richard will take a pass and open the floor.
All right, the questions are yours. And if you would kindly wait until the microphone comes to you before you talk, because
There are two with microphones.
Yep. I see one question in the back.
Richard, a couple weeks ago, I went to Hayneville stand where you and Daniel Jonathan stood. And the question that kept coming back to me was, how could you ever forgive? And how did you work through the anger and the desire to strike back?
Dr. Frank Miles spent some time with me working on that. For instance, he thought he was from Murfreesboro, Tennessee, a Civil War site. He'd gone to be a neurosurgeon, among other schools. He'd gone to Northwestern, where I ended up going to law school in Chicago. He wondered how come I wasn't angry. He and his wife were wondering, and my feeling was I never knew Tom Coleman. I suppose I could have worked up an anger, but to have been angry would have done nothing to Coleman, and might have eaten up a lot of myself. So I know when my daughter went down there to spend a winter term, she spent a month working with the Catholic Sisters in Lowndes County, and working with kids after school, working with adults during the day. She was tempted to go and knock on his front door. He was still living, and say, "Hi, I'm Siobhan. I'm Richard's daughter." But she didn't do that, and I never pushed her to do it, and I never felt a need to do that. Curiously, John Hewlett, the black sheriff who won, I believe, 1971, took a little while for those laws to be effective, felt that Coleman was an interesting character. He would come down to the sheriff's department and offer to help. His problem was these outside types, Jonathan, myself. Mr. Hewlett telling me this, that Ruby's shaking her head. But he still, you know, you're saying he didn't treat locals as well as he, right? But what I suppose there certainly was my share of post-traumatic stress syndrome. If I had known what that was at the time, it was there, and took a long time to work its way out. Went through a fair amount of psychiatric counseling, but somehow I just kind of got involved in community things. I had many classmates, for instance, who were very interested in pastoral counseling. Pastoral counseling was really big in the 60s for marriage, and yet somehow I kind of focused on urban things, the things that led to city planning, that led to working in community over jobs and the vote and participation in public processes, politics, if you will. I just, anger did not seem to me a viable route, and as a result, did not waste much time being angry at Tom Coleman.
I think you asked a huge question, and the way I take that also, thank you, Richard, for the personalizing it, is the fire of indignation that we want that keeps us going, and how do we keep it from demonizing the other. And I think in Baltimore, I can't remember the church was out there big time the last week and a half, and one service, the minister brought community folks who were picketing, had a prayer service with the police, with their shields. And it was an extraordinary, perhaps transformative moment. So the way I'm taking your question is not only Richard's personal account, but how, if you're angry, if you're outraged at the obscenities, prevalence of guns, whatever it is, how you keep that while at the same, how you keep that edge while at the same time forgiving the other and maybe making the other not so much the other.
Thank you.
Other questions?
First of all, I just want to thank the panel for your very insightful and helpful comments. Dr. Morrisroe, you asked, was his death worth it? Was your injury worth it? It seems to me that at the micro level, the answer is yes. At the macro level, the answer is probably not. I have been reading 3 books recently about the history of this country and its present reality. Nathaniel Pritchett's book, Mayflower, Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, and Michelle Anderson's book, The New Jim Crow. It seems to me we can talk the talk pretty well. Some people walk the talk, but we don't do much at all when it comes to the systemic national and cultural issues that need to be addressed and the changes that we need to make to assure equality and justice for all people. And I just wonder if you have any comments about what we can do systemically and nationally to move this whole enterprise forward in a creative and just way.
I find it very difficult as a sort of great society product. We used to teach social problems at that time, sociology courses, and to find that we've gotten so far in terms of blaming the poor for their poverty and blaming the unemployed for their lack of employment. And I think of Baby Lou's daughter. Baby Lou lives down around the corner, and she works She was a manager at McDonald's she might have been up to $9 an hour instead of $7.50. She now works she works the night shift at a Speedway gas station, and then she goes to do the day shift at a Panera food service, and her brother, through some mix of clout and luck, has a pretty decent job at BP, the major refinery. But just to see her spending 16 hours a day of her life with these relatively dead-end jobs is just, and yet she has a glow about her that it's hard to knock her. It just somehow it has meaning to her, and she goes about it. She has enough of a work ethic that she puts up with that. And doesn't give up and kind of keeps going. And so I think the structural things, I just find it very difficult to find out what the current common denominator is in Congress as far as what the problems are with American society and what the
Current denominator is wealth, but
I think that I think it's important to keep that focus, to keep the focus on systemic questions, and talking about the fact that we actually have systems in place in this country, like you said, based on wealth, that need to be dismantled, and that's a scary thing to talk about. I think sometimes it's really easy for us, and I'm probably not going to be really popular saying this, but it's really easy to talk about things like restorative justice and forgiveness because it's really comfortable to talk about those things. So we emphasize the victim forgiving the perpetrator of injustice, but we don't talk about the perpetrator repenting. We don't like to talk about repentance as much as we like to talk about forgiveness. And so that's something that I kind of always keep in mind. Restorative justice is something I always am I question a bit, especially around the emphasis around interpersonal forgiveness and the kind of assumption that if we can just interpersonally get along, that everything will be okay. That really removes the kind of systemic questions. We like to talk about racism in a way that, well, if we could just get together and talk, everything would be okay. Instead of talking about the systems that are in place that systematically deny people and communities of color from the means to life, that keep people in poverty, that enforce unemployment, and that are enforced directly through violence and through police violence and state violence. And and it's not just a matter of how can we reconcile. It's a matter of the fact that the system is kept in place by violence. And that's a systemic question, not a question of whether or not, if a few community members just sat down with the police, things would change. There's a system in place that keeps all of this going and that benefits somebody, but it definitely doesn't benefit the communities that are oppressed.
I think for me, you've presented really a very stark challenge, because in your opening comments you talked about your ministry of presence, and the whole relational, I think, is absolutely huge. The whole business of Thou Art Mine is tremendous, and you are a child of God, and you are wonderful. And that, I talk a lot about that in my speeches, and it's often poo-pooed as the soft stuff. Well, we all know as spouses or ex-spouses or employees or bosses or whatever, that the relationship is probably the toughest of the tough work. That, I think, is there, but then the systemic question you raised, it's David, right? It's huge. And for me, and we're either made wise by our experience or absolutely parochial, that I feel it's beginning to come up through these cities and mayors and city councilors. Now how that, because they're closest to the pain, they're closest to the anger, at least in my work. You painted some fairly stark picture of the city council where you are. But I work very closely with these cities, and yet I sit at the Justice Department table. And their work in the cities is to develop a comprehensive plan of prevention, family work, whatever, intervention, mentoring after school, enforcement, and reentry. And what I have asked them to do, and now Justice is saying, tell us what you can do, and the cities are coming back and saying, we can do X, we can do half of Y, we can't do the other half of Y, and we can't do Z unless. Now my experience so far has been Justice is very, very nervous about that unless part. And a lot of what the unless part is mayors saying, we need a national jobs program. We've got to rebuild our infrastructure. We got to get this manufacturing back. Now, right, it is very clear what's coming back. How that's being heard is another question. But for me, for this moment in time, I'm feeling slightly encouraged by this. And, but my take on what you said is this tension that I feel between the necessity of the relational and the structural.
We have about 5 minutes left, so I think we have time for one more question with a bunch of good answers.
Can't guarantee that.
In hearing what you were talking about on the personal level, interpersonal level, it seems to me that the national conversation is controlled by people who turn it to the interpersonal level every time the structural or institutional question arises. It gets pushed back to the interpersonal level.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
That's
where
good.
the victim becomes responsible for
Yeah,
the poverty.
that's good. That's fair.
Always.
Thank God for Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah.
Any other question? Go ahead.
Yes, good. He's a wonderful guy.
I'm not sure how to ask this because it's an impossible question, but we were invited at the very opening to share openly whatever advice we have for EDS as it moves forward, seeks new ways, tries to live a transformative purpose and mission. What advice would each of you give to the current administration in terms of how EDS can further the cause of justice that you so strongly are committed to? Is there any advice, specific question, or how would you frame the conversation
for those who are doing the hard work of trying to figure out where does EDS go now?
I think, among other things, that it's very important to provide opportunities for students, just as Jonathan learned a great deal from the time he spent in Providence, Rhode Island, working with an inner city church and tutoring kids, whatever, to provide opportunities, internships, if you will, of some kind that expose people to worlds they're not familiar with. That I think it's probably true that the majority of students at EDS still come from relatively privileged backgrounds. And that I think to challenge them to meet other worlds is very important.
I am not very far from my EDS education, and I was here during some of the more difficult years at EDS, and also tremendously appreciate and appreciated my professors here and the education I received here. If I had any advice, it would be listen to students, but also more broadly, listen to, if we're talking about talking about justice in the future, talking about being relevant in today's world, I would say listen to the social movements already on the ground. Elevate their voices. Let their voices be heard through EDS. EDS has a great history of being involved in social movements, but it can be difficult sometimes to listen to the new ones and recognize that tactics are going to be different, and language is going to be different, and the players are going to be different. And so we have teenagers on the streets of Baltimore, and we have young people on the streets of Ferguson, and we have queer women, and we have so many voices from so many different movements around the country. So elevate those voices, listen to those voices, and don't expect necessarily that the tactics will be the same and that everything will be the same. But so that there's that exchange, right, of wisdom from the past, but also recognizing that it's a new time with new issues and new tactics. I often think about, when I think about tactics, I think about how prevalent civil disobedience type measures were in the civil rights movement, and how almost impossible some of those same things can be today. With poverty criminalized the way it is, if you're in a poor community and you do a sit-in and you get arrested, you're going to spend time in prison, not a couple days in jail. And so those types of things we don't always think about. But my advice to EDS would be listen to the voices already on the ground.
Two comments. One, that's a very, very dear friend of mine, Don Abbott, who, I just have to say this publicly, Don, his own witness for years, was a peace vigil. And every day, every night in the rain or the snow around the war issues of Iraq and everything else. Man and his wife I have a great deal of admiration for, so thank you for the question, Don. Dean, would put it on you. I would start a Faith and Public Policy Institute, and it's not just exposing the students, it would bring in policy leaders and exposing them. And I would hook up in some way with the Kennedy School and have a major chunk of your work here, a Faith and Public Policy Institute. I don't know who else is doing it academically around here, what your competition might be, but you're within walking distance of the Kennedy School, and I think could be huge ferment. But to me, it's not just exposing the students, it's exposing the policymakers to these issues. And reflecting back on Jonathan, you had some policymakers marching too, and how we can get there, and maybe you can help plant the seed. So I know you don't have anything else to do, so let me know by next week how you're doing.
And with that, I'd like to thank the panel again. And don't go away, we have another amazing 90 minutes coming right up.